Welcome back to the Daily Factor. Well, over 100 years ago, the Chinese went away just like the Russians and became a communist. Now, this happened 4 years after the Russian Revolution and would set a precedence for a sort of a communist uprising to occur in the Far East in later years to come. Well, joining me to discuss these 100 years, I'd like to welcome Dr. David MONYAE. He's the director for the Center for Africa-China Studies at the University of Johannesburg. Dr. MONYAE, good afternoon, and thank you so much for joining us.
Good afternoon.
Dr. MONYAE, I think what's interesting is that you get the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917. One would think, okay, it won't really spread into the Far East. 4 years later on, that just exactly happens.
Indeed, I think that was an interesting era, that revolution was much more expected in Western developed countries, as Karl Marx had alluded to. And unfortunately, it happened in a much more backward countries such as Russia, and then later a peasant revolution in China by 1949.
Dr. MONYAE, what was interesting is, of course, General Mao. He was this leading figure of the revolution, and in later years we would see Japan sort of coming in and invading China just before just before World War II had arrived. But it seemed as if communism stuck within the fall of China, and that would develop into an economic stranglehold of the Chinese people.
Indeed, I think the major lesson that we have learned throughout the revolution, particularly led by Chairman Mao, is that I think he did put a lot of thinking around how to win over the people. And it has always been a people-centered. A lot of mistakes were made along the way, and whether throughout the Long March and the manner in which they fought the Japanese. But nonetheless, I think the idea of being a people-centered party, it has made it survive all these long, and in government since 1949. And as you are aware, a lot of other mistakes also made, but the ability to reform and constantly modernize the party itself and all ways of governance within government has made China indeed a much more powerful country, even getting much more better than some Western democratic as well as capitalist states.
Yeah, and you hit the nail on the head there, Dr. MONYAE. Fall of the destruction of the Berlin Wall, the USSR is gone, there's no more Soviet Union, Russia goes into a republic, but China stands and stands with that communist ideology, and as you say, they've taken it now into the modern world.
Yes, and I think the lessons for Chinese, I think, came from the collapse of the then Soviet Union. With Gorbachev and Yeltsin and up to current President Putin, I think you've seen the Russians took a rather a negative way. They collapsed both the glasnost and perestroika, two contradictory systems in terms of opening both political and economic. The Chinese took a totally different strategy that they're going to open up fully the economy, but have a strong hold on politics. And therefore, the idea of being influenced by Western liberal internationalism, has been put on hold, frustrating the West. And I think at the moment, the major contrast or tension between China and Western countries is centered around the fact that Chinese refuse to open up their political space.
Yeah, and we saw that with then U.S. President Donald Trump, Prime Minister Xi Jinping, just standing firm in a lot of his beliefs. And whether you agree with it or not, the situation in Taiwan, what is happening in Hong Kong right now, you heard him in his speech yesterday. Prime Minister Xi Jinping, he's adamant that whatever ideologies China have right now, they are sticking to it till the end.
And I think they'll definitely win on that front, as long as the Chinese Communist Party delivers services to people, open up the rural area, deal with massive poverty, as well as modernize, ensure that the growth and economic success is shared by majority of people. I think it will get more legitimacy from the people. And in a way, I think they'll use that as a defensive mechanism against the intrusion of a Western and neoliberal approach that the Western countries are trying to do.
Dr. MONYAE, the question about the employment, we saw a couple of weeks ago when the South African Communist Party had their sort of unveiling before the centenary happens this month. Unemployment's at a minimal in China right now. And I think when you look at the ideology of communism and you look at that, it seems to be working quite well for them, isn't it?
Indeed, and there are major lessons for the SACP. It has been in government since 1994 and failed dismally, we must say, to really influence the nationalist ANC into delivery to the masses of the people. The so-called National Democratic Revolution, it hasn't come in South Africa and people are not enjoying. And all the crises that we see in the country has to do with the lack of reforms, lack of transformation, and lack of delivery of services. And poverty is widening. And while very few elites are succeeding in their partnership with the so-called white monopoly capital. And therefore, there is a need for rethink within the SACP, whether they continue in alliance with the ANC or stand on their own as a party and influence ideology in terms of winning the masses of our people. As far as lessons from China, there are certain elements of Chinese model that could work on the African continent, in South Africa in particular, but not everything. I think it's a question of selecting certain policies that work and try to make them conducive to our local environment.
Dr. MONYAE, one final question. China has become an industrialized society, mentioned that unemployment's at a minimal. We tend to believe that if one model works, it may work for the other. Is this a norm, or is this just the one exception, what is currently happening in the Far East Giant?
I think it keeps the hope for the majority of people in the so-called third world or developing world that there is not only, as you can remember, as far back as 1990, up to 1994, the major argument, even in the post-1994, it has always been that there is no alternative to a new liberal policies from the West. And therefore, all what we do in South Africa and across the African continent, we have and we must do it because that's the only option is there. Now, I think the world is starting to see an emerging model, which is the Chinese model. It gives us an options that we can learn certain policies from the Western world and combine with certain lessons from Chinese model and build our own to ensure that all what we're learning from the outside world fit into our local conditions for our own quest for development.
Dr. David MONYAE, we say thank you so much for joining us. Much appreciated.
You're most welcome.
Dr. David MONYAE, Director for the Center for Africa-China Studies at the University of Johannesburg. We discuss the centenary of communist China and whether it works at this very moment in the modern world. Well, coming up after the break, we'll be shifting our focus to community news. Stay tuned.